You guys, I gave it my best shot. I really did. I genuinely wanted to like this movie. It gives me no pleasure at all to report. I saw The Return. It was bad. There it is. That's my review. Episode over. No, I am going to talk a little bit about this movie and why I did not think it worked. Because if you've been following the show, you know that I have been waiting for this movie for like half a year now. We started out this big series on Homer and the Homeric epics because I knew that in December there was a movie coming out called The Return with Ralph Fiennes and Juliette Binoche, two terrific actors, especially Juliette Binoche I love, but Fiennes is also always great. And I was super excited about this because I thought we really haven't had good screen adaptations of the Homeric epics in a while. It feels like in this season of our culture where we are making all of these epics and adaptations and superhero movies and using all this pre-existing IP, the Homeric poems are great candidates for that. This seems like a really rich vein to tap while you're trying to find all of this other time-tested material, which seems to be what Hollywood is doing, is they're trying to dredge up all this stuff that they know is going to work, they know people love. We know that these stories work. They have endured. They have stood the test of time. And what I wanted to do in the lead up to this movie coming out was give you the backdrop so you can see what's great about the stories. And that's why we embarked upon this grand multi-week series through the Homeric poems. We started out at the very beginning of the story of how the Trojan War got started. Then we leapt into the Iliad and told the story of how Achilles feuded with Agamemnon and this rage that caused the war both to fall apart but also to be driven to its ultimate conclusion. And then after that, the 10-year siege of Troy ends and you have 10 years of wandering by Odysseus. This second poem, slightly more picaresque, slightly more comic, a little bit more disjointed and even modern in some ways. It's much more an introspective story about identity as well as it is a swashbuckling adventure out on the high seas. And we walked through the whole thing so that we could get ready to understand what is going on in this movie. The Return covers the last sections, the last books of the Odyssey. And I thought that was a really interesting approach. I was cautiously optimistic to see how they dealt with it because, as I have stressed a couple times on the show, Odysseus goes through these very elaborate, dramatic, fantastical journeys with monsters and whirlpools and all kinds of gods and mythic creatures and elements, and that's what most people remember about the poem. But actually, that part of the poem is very small. It's a short section that Odysseus mostly narrates in flashback. He tells it to his hosts, the Phaeacians, and then a big chunk, like almost half of this poem, the second half of the poem, is about what happens after he returns home to Ithaca. He's the king of Ithaca. He was when he left. Now his status is a bit contested because he's been gone for 20 years. Most people seem to think he's dead. His wife, Penelope, is waiting for him. She's been sitting at her loom, weaving, waiting all these years, and she's, of course, the embodiment of the faithful woman. Her name is almost synonymous with patience and love and grace and the feminine virtues that Homer is interested in the character of Penelope, whereas, of course, Odysseus is the intrepid adventurer who has to make his way back to becoming a family man after the war. He's certainly suffering from what we would now call PTSD. There's a kind of loss of identity that soldiers go through when they leave the war and they leave their comrades behind. And in Odysseus' case, he actually loses all of his comrades. They all die. If they haven't died at Troy, they die on the journey home. And so some of the most emotionally dramatic sections of the poem come once he arrives, and he has to basically make contact with each different section of his household. He has to re-encounter his servants, people like Eumaeus, the good swineherd, who've been waiting for him and who have been adrift without a good master, who have now been abused by the suitors who are here trying to win Penelope's hand. They're trying to take his place, but they're doing it not in a chivalrous kind of genteel and measured way that is fitted to the norms of Greek society and the virtues that Greeks ought to uphold, but instead they're doing it in this rapacious, nasty, and evil way that's taking advantage of this woman who's lost without her husband. So he has to deal with them and has to recover order in his household. He has to make contact with his son, whom he barely knows. He left when this boy was just an infant, and now he's at least 20 years old, because that's how long Odysseus has been gone. And there's an enormous amount of emotion in that encounter, and things that have been unsaid for years and years that have to now be said, and they have to reconcile there. Then there's Penelope, is the climax, really, of this whole adventure, is how is the encounter going to go between them. Penelope is in this very delicate and tragic state that we see dramatized throughout the poem, where she is waiting for him. She does hope that he will be alive, but she's hoping against hope, as we now say. She has this yearning, this feeling, this fortitude, and this devotion, but everyone around her almost is saying, I think you should probably give up. And it seems obvious that she should give up. Like, the suitors are all basically saying, like, you need a man to protect you, and why can't you just, like, move on from this obvious tragedy? And the suitors are doing that in a nasty, aggressive way, but they have a point, sort of, in that Penelope is vastly overstaying. I mean, she's waiting much longer than she has to, let's put it this way, right? And so her fidelity is mythical in the same way that Odysseus' journeys are mythical. And this is a grand story that depicts kind of the height of human attachment, human love, and human commitment, even as Odysseus is sort of shipwrecked and tossed across the waves and all of that. They at last come back together. So it's a beautifully depicted story, and it's very, very human in the poem. If you remember when we read the sections that deal with these reconciliations, they are subtle, they're careful, they are not overly easy or simplistic. It's not like Odysseus instantly comes home and everything's fine. It actually requires many steps for them to get back together towards one another and make the family whole again. And I thought there's a lot of good stuff in here for a movie. But in order to do it right, in order to do it well, you have to accept the premises of the story. You have to imagine yourself into this world where men go off to war, that's what men do, where the rules of sexual fidelity are not the same for men and women, where we're not dealing with a Christian society that has Christian ideas about marriage and monogamy. There are some different ethics there that we don't share, so you have to imagine yourself into that world. And you have to imagine yourself into a world where male and female roles are different. And this is something that we still, I think, could believe, although, of course, it's very unpopular now to say this, but men and women have different roles in this household. They're collaborators. They are not equivalents. That is, Odysseus has a job going out to war. He has a job coming back to bring order to the house. Penelope has a job to keeping the internal peace of the household, raising the children, supervising the female servants. All of that stuff is on her. And you have to accept that as well in order to really tell this story. There's another element that you have to accept to tell this story, which is the mythic element, the fact that this takes place in a world with supernatural, we would now say, gods and creatures and all kinds of fantasy elements that you just have to accept as part of the Greek worldview. That's, to me, somewhat less important. I would have been really pleasantly surprised if they found a way to incorporate that into this movie, because modern movies tend to be very allergic to the gods and to the mythic elements of Greek stories. They were very afraid that they're going to come across as corny. We don't really know how to get back into that mindset. So I wasn't totally, it didn't feel necessary to me that this movie should have that in it. But it did feel necessary that they should be able to face up to what happens in the story, which is that a man of the ancient world comes home and reestablishes order. And I think we're supposed to think that is a good thing, even though there are moral questions that it raises. The fact that Odysseus comes home, slaughters the suitors en masse, and restores order to his household, we're supposed to think that that's a good thing. And I really was wondering whether they were going to be able to put this on screen, and if so, how. And man, I just think they whiffed it. I'm sorry to say I really did not like this movie. I liked it less and less as it went along. And I've seen some people online saying that actually they thought it was okay, that of course they changed some things from the poem, but it's still a pretty good movie, still interesting to watch. And I get that. I don't require that a screen adaptation have all the same plot beats as the original. I know that that's never true, and it's not even a good thing. You need to change things around so that you can fit something on the screen. It's a different medium. Oral poetry, sung poetry, like the Homeric epics, is a different medium from modern cinema. So I totally get that. But when you're doing an adaptation, my rule is that you shouldn't be preserving the letter of the poem, that is the specific story beats, each one, but you should be preserving the spirit. The changes that you make should be to preserve what is actually the heart of what's going on in the story. And I felt that the makers of this movie, the director and the writers, is directed by a guy called Uberto Pasolini, who you may know from his previous movie, The Full Monty, and then written by Edward Bond and John Colley, along with Uberto Pasolini. I felt that these guys were hostile to the spirit of the poem, or allergic to the spirit of the poem, and addicted to the spirit of our times and to the prejudices of our times. And I want to say a little bit about what I mean by that. First and foremost, I think what we are dealing with, our biggest obstacle to the ancient mindset in the modern world, is our addiction to what we think of as realism. We have this idea about what is real and what is not real. And when we read a poem about, say, the gods and the Cyclops, and even great heroes of war and dramatic episodes that take place between ancient civilizations, in our heads, always, there is this division between what's real and what's not real, because we think that the world does not contain gods and epic heroes and all of these entities that we find in the poem. And so we assume that the ancient writers who talked about those things must have been imagining them. They must have been in some way making them up or misinterpreting the world to include such things as gods and heroes. And therefore we split in our head, always when we read these poems, we split the poem between stuff that we think, quote unquote, actually happened. We have this underlying idea that there was some series of events, and then the quote unquote mythological elements of the story, that the original writers took the actual events and they layered on all of these fantastical elements. And maybe we think they did it for good reasons, to tell an allegory, to tell a story. Maybe we think that this was just part of their culture, even though they were mistaken, pre-scientific, archaic cultural ideas. But whatever happens, even if we wouldn't say this outright, we all instinctively, I think, we read Homer, we read the epics, and we think, this is a fantastical, imaginary, fairy tale version of some reality. And so in our heads, there emerges this picture of, quote unquote, the real poem underneath the poem, right? When you're reading the Odyssey or the Iliad, I think as moderns, we are naturally inclined to take in this poem as if what we're getting here is a kind of screen through which we can discern some underlying reality. And that is why when we go to make these movies, when we try to put Homer on screen, we always try to make it, quote unquote, realist by telling the story totally differently, because we assume that we know what actually happened. And usually, from our perspective, what actually happened is much more drab and dreary and sad and full of doubt and angst, because we think that's reality and anything else is a kind of fiction. And I do not believe in the Greek gods in the way that Homer believed in the Greek gods. But when Homer talks to me about the Greek gods, I assume he's talking to me about something. And when he talks to me about heroes and their adventures and the triumph and the glory that was inherent in those adventures, I assume that he's describing an experience that if I'd been there, I would have had that experience too. And so I feel it's a terrible mistake to try to explain that away implicitly by presenting, quote unquote, the real story, where you think like, oh yeah, what really happened is Odysseus was this haggard veteran, disillusioned and miserable as he comes home from the war, and all this other stuff is just propaganda or narrative that has been spun around it. Only a modern would think that way, and it's not actually reflective of the truth. It's not reflective of how ancient people seem to have experienced warfare. It's also not reflective of how actual reality works. Like in real life, yes, we do have doubts, we do have sorrows, we do have grief and pain in war. And I talked and drew that out from the poem in our series on the actual poetry. But we also have aspirations, we have noble ideals, we have moments of triumph. And in the ancient world, I would suggest there were even more of those moments of triumph in warfare, because it was a different kind of thing. It was hand-to-hand combat a lot of the time. There were less moral, ethical concerns about it, and people would have felt more ebullience and triumph and joy. And so it's actually false. It's not realist, even though we think of it as realist. It's false to strip away all of those more noble and elevated elements from the poem and try to get down to, quote unquote, the bare bones of what's actually going on. That's an illusion produced by our modern prejudices about what is real and what isn't real. And I think that this movie totally fell for that, and therefore became not only more boring and dull and kind of depressing than the original story, but also less realistic. It made less sense than the original story, less emotional sense, less narrative sense, because none of the things that make the poem cohere as an epic, as a story of glory and of homecoming and joy and return, none of those things were there. And they were all replaced with this kind of hyper-modernist, quote-unquote, realist idea that it's all disillusionment and it's all sorrow. But as I will now try to show, if you do that, the story stops making any sense. So realism actually becomes incoherent, less realistic, less sensical. It makes less logical sense when you take away one half of the poem and its spirit, because you think that that is an illusion, whereas the underlying reality must have been just gore and sorrow and doubt. So let me walk through this movie a little bit and try to show why that is. I'm not going to worry about spoilers because we all know how this story goes at this point, and I assume if you're going to the movie, you're not going to find out what happens to Odysseus. You're going to see how they depict this classic story, as in fact the Greeks would have done when they listened to the recitation of Homer. They wouldn't have wanted to know what's going to happen. They would have wanted to know how it plays out. And so in that way, we have a similar experience going to this movie if we know the story already. And so opening shot comes up, right? I'm watching this movie. It starts out okay. And remember, I really want to like this movie, so I'm ready to enjoy it. Very beautifully shot. One thing I will say for Pasolini is that he's got a wonderful eye, and he really manages to make you see the world of the Odyssey as a Greek world, a world of Greek peasantry. Like, you can recognize kind of these peasant peoples walking through this rocky island of Ithaca, and you can also see how they are the characters from the poem. So it really visualizes the poem very well. And it opens with a really cool shot that actually kind of does something which I talked about when we were talking about the poem, that there is this parallelism between Penelope and Odysseus. Odysseus is at the mast of his ship, and Penelope is at her loom, and she's weaving, and the story is that she's putting off the suitors by saying, I'm going to weave a burial shroud for Laertes, my father-in-law, Odysseus' father. And every night she unweaves the stuff that she's woven. And so she's stuck at the loom, he's stuck at his ship, at his mast. And these are parallel images of what the two of them are. And in Greek, in fact, the words for describing them are very similar. You have a histon, a standing thing in both cases. And so there's this linguistic parallel, and there's this sort of spiritual parallel between the male and the female elements of this. And I was saying at the time, like, if I were filming this, I would do a kind of fade out overlay where you see Odysseus at his prow at the ship, and then you fade out overlay to Penelope and you see her at her loom. And Pasolini doesn't quite do that, but he starts out with this shot of the ocean, this very beautiful shot of the ocean tide, and then the tide, the color of the sea melts away into the color of the fabric that Penelope is weaving. And so he clearly understands, he's clearly thought about the poem. It's not like he's totally ignorant of Homer and how it works. And I thought, okay, this is promising. Like, you get the idea that these are two, in some ways, the male and female version of heroism, kind of opposed against each other in this complementary fashion. And then, again, promisingly, the first few scenes of the movie are kind of all about guest friendship, which is this Homeric idea, xenia, and it's a Greek value. Homer seems to think of xenia, the idea that you take in guests, and this is a way of being virtuous. When strangers come to your shore, you take them in, you give them gifts, you feed them, you have this reciprocal relationship between the noble houses of the various Greek city-states, right? That's xenia, this idea that you come to my house or my palace if I'm the king, and I put you up and I give you gifts and I hear your tales and we dine, and then the next time I'm traveling through your region, I come to your palace and you do the same. And there is this kind of mutual understanding among the Greek speakers. And that is connected to virtue. It's also connected to civilization. Wherever Odysseus goes on his journeys, he tries to see if the people that he finds there are able to recognize the morals, the ethics of guest friendship. And if they are, then they are civilized. That's why the Phaeacians are clearly civilized. But Odysseus learns on his journey that not everybody is civilized, that these values don't fall out of the sky, that they're in some ways delivered by our culture, that our culture and our home protects these values. And what I liked about the opening of this movie is that Eumaeus, who is the good, virtuous swineherd that's been waiting for Odysseus to come home, the servant of the house, Eumaeus is offended by the suitors primarily because they don't respect guest friendship. And that is very close to the poem itself. There's a great exchange where when Odysseus first washes up on shore, Eumaeus takes him in and somebody asks him, why take in a stranger and risk their anger? That is, risk the suitors' anger. And Eumaeus says, because they haven't turned us into animals yet. And I thought that's great. That establishes exactly the stakes of this conflict, that these guys are behaving like animals. They are behaving like non-human, non-civilized individuals. And that is very much what the poem conveys and is part of why Odysseus is right to take his household back, that he represents not just a personal stake, a personal claim on Ithaca, but the enforcer of a whole cultural system of values and indeed absolute moral goods that are better than other ways of living. And Eumaeus gets this across. He obviously critiques the suitors for exactly this reason. They thought, great, okay, we've got that like kind of moral framework in place. That's a good scene. As Eumaeus is kind of nursing Odysseus back to health, we get this idea that Odysseus is a stranger in his own land. We get, all importantly, if the movie had done nothing else, it would still have been worth seeing. All importantly, we get Argos, the dog, who has been waiting for Odysseus this whole time, is one of the only ones who recognizes him and then instantly dies. It's an incredibly heart-wrenching, moving moment. And in fact, it is very heart-wrenching and moving on screen. I shed a manly tear. It was very cool that they got that moment in there. It's a great cinematic moment. There are a lot of great cinematic moments. This is one that they captured from the poem. Others they left on the table, as I'm going to get into. But so, there were some promising elements at the outset. I thought, okay, this could be good. Then gradually, it started to fall apart, and I liked it less and less. And it had to do with this problem of realism. And the first moment that I noticed it actually was very early on when Odysseus washes ashore. He shows up naked on the shore and unconscious. And in the poem, that's kind of what happens. But you may remember that he's been brought there by the Phaeacians, by these mythical sailors who live in a kind of utopia, a no man's land, this weird Brigadoon-type place that Homer maybe even invented that wasn't part of the mythology before. And it's this way station where Odysseus has returned to himself, returned to civilization. It's where he tells his story. It's a very important, pivotal inflection point in the plot, that the Phaeacians take him in and they clean him up and then they send him back home. This movie cannot do any of that because it is determined to strip away the mythological elements. And so you can tell from that early shot that this is going to be a demythologized version of the story, which was my first disappointment. But again, like I say, this is pretty common. This is what we got, say, in Troy, right? The movie Troy, where they told the Iliad and they took out all the gods. I understand that this is something that filmmakers feel an impulse to do because they don't know how to portray the magical stuff without it veering into hokiness or corniness or fantasy, and they wanted to depict this as if it really happened. We have a hard time imagining that the world of gods is some world of real human experience, and we can't think our way into that mindset, and so we stripped the gods out, and I was like, all right, so they've taken the Phaeacians out of this story, and they've made it a much more indecorous landing. He is just kind of sprawled out there. He's obviously wounded and miserable. What happens then in the poem is that Athena comes and disguises him as an old man. So I knew that wasn't going to happen. If they're not going to put the Phaeacians in there, they're not going to put Athena in there to help him kind of make his way back. Instead, he basically is just so disheveled that he is unrecognizable and people can't tell who he is, so he is kind of automatically disguised. But here's my thing about that, and this is a question that I'm going to come back to again and again, is like, if the Phaeacians didn't bring him there, how did he get there? Like, there are these enormous unanswered questions that they keep sort of vaguely alluding to the answers, but they don't really tell us, like, where he's been, what he's been up to. The guy's been wandering for 10 years, and the closest thing we get to a description of why is that he has been hanging out with, I guess it's supposed to be Calypso, the kind of witch goddess that he stays with in the poem for many years. And she does kind of hold him there, and that is a big part of why he stays away. But since she can't be a witch, she can't be a goddess, she can't be a nymph, she can't be anything in this movie, the only reason he can't have been staying with her, and this is implied, is that he wanted to, that he was like just kind of having a great time, sleeping with this hot babe. And also that he was too traumatized. And we're going to get into that part, the war trauma part of it in a bit. But this suggestion is like this was just a kind of dalliance on his part, or he was too afraid to come home because he felt that he'd been turned into a monster by the war. But people keep asking him, like, where have you been? What were you doing? How did you get back? And he keeps saying these sort of grim, like, brooding things, like, sometimes the war becomes your home. Like, I have been lost, this very ponderous sort of screenplay writing. And I feel like, first of all, that's not the story. That's not what actually happened to Odysseus. And since it's not what happened to Odysseus, his homecoming is not actually the homecoming of somebody that's been trying to stay away. It's the homecoming of somebody who's been trying desperately to get back, has been fighting his way back for years and years, trying really hard. So that changes the story off the bat. But also, like, just speaking realistically, like from a standpoint of realism, this guy's been gone for 10 years. Everybody's been wondering where he is. They ask him where he's been, and he's like, I have been lost. And I'm sorry, but if I imagine myself even into the realist world of this movie, and that's what my dad or my husband says on his return, that's not a good enough answer. Like, in real life, somebody would say, okay, but like, what do you mean? Like, what were you doing? Where have you been? And we get some suggestion at the end of the movie that they're going to talk to each other about it, that he and Penelope are going to talk to each other about it. But there is this enormous plot hole that is opened up by the hyper-realism of the movie that makes it really hard to understand, like, who this character is. And the only suggestions we get about who this character is are actually, like, really different. It's not the story of Odysseus anymore, if this is a guy who was so traumatized by the war that he fled to Calypso's arms and just didn't want to face his family, didn't want to see them because he felt that they wouldn't recognize the way that the war has transformed him. Like, at that point, you're almost telling a completely different story. Odysseus is changed by the war. Odysseus does need to reincorporate himself into society, but the whole story of the poem is that he's fighting to do that every step of the way, including on Calypso's island, where he begs her to let him go. And the gods have to basically demand that Calypso release him. And this is true also in Circe's bed. You know, his crew has to kind of remind him where he's going, but it's not because he's like so afraid of what's going to happen when he gets home, and he has no reason to be, because all the concerns that Penelope has about him are kind of modern concerns that, like, oh, you've been doing all these terrible things in war. Oh, you've been sleeping around. Oh, you might have raped people in war. These are all bad things from our modern perspective. But it's not clear to me at all from the poem or from the values of the ancient world that that's actually what Penelope would have been concerned about. So by removing the obstacles, the mythological obstacles to his return, they actually show, this movie actually revealed to me that those mythological obstacles are there for a very important reason, because it makes it possible for the journey to be one that Odysseus is trying to make. In other words, if there are no mythological obstacles, if there's no sea demon trying to shipwreck him, if there's no Cyclops that's trying to kill him and eat him, then the only thing that can possibly be holding him back is his own personal reservations about coming home. And that's a very different story. And so Homer puts those obstacles in his way, in part, so that he can convey and make clear to us that Odysseus wants to get home. That is like one of the most important things about Odysseus' character. He really wants to get home. There are problems in his way, and some of those problems are psychological, and some of them include having lost his men, some of them include figuring out how to live in civilized life again. All of that is true, but at every point, Odysseus wants really badly to solve those obstacles. So if you take those obstacles away, you make Odysseus into the obstacle. You turn him into the problem. And that is basically what this movie is about. It's about how Odysseus is the problem. And everybody resents him, and everybody's mad at him, and they're right to be, because he has basically been like feeling his feelings for 10 years while his island falls apart. And he is not a good guy in this movie. Like, they kind of make him into this tortured hero. But unless he is actually trying to get home, he's not really a tortured hero. He's sort of a coward. And that is why all the other characters then have to be changed around him. And they have to become these resentful, angry, angsty people, because he has lost his purpose, his mission, his reason for existing. And so again, the realism, like the so-called realism of stripping away the gods, actually makes the story make a lot less sense, and it makes it grimmer, way more dull and drear, and I thought ultimately kind of boring. Like, after a while, I was like, there are too many pauses in this movie. I came out of it, and I went to it with my mom and dad. I'm staying with my parents right now, visiting them for the holidays, and so we all went together. And afterward, I turned to my dad and I was like, I read that poem. I read the Odyssey. It had a happy ending. Like, this is such a depressing movie, and it's also so slow because the only thing it can be about is like this internal turmoil that probably isn't really reflective of what would have gone on, and also doesn't make any sense within the structure of the movie. And this is another feature of realism, is because quote-unquote realism divides the world into fantasies of glory and realities of material flesh and death. Right? Everything has to become more dark, more grim, and more depressing. And a line came to my mind that I recently read from the memoirs of Charles de Gaulle. This was the guy who defeated, well, he didn't defeat, but he fought back against the Hitler occupation of France. The Nazi occupation of France took over, the Vichy government collaborated, but de Gaulle fought back, and he was kind of in this close collaboration with Churchill, and they were the resistance in France. It was a great act of heroism. And de Gaulle is actually a great example of how, in the modern world, the world of blood and guts, the world of science, the world of tanks, the world of bombs, all of that, there is still the experience of heroism, because de Gaulle was a hero. And in fighting Hitler, he says something in his memoirs, which have recently been re-released. He says something really important. He says Hitler based his colossal plan on the strength he attributed to man's baseness. Yet men are made of souls as much as clay. It's a great line. Men are made of souls as much as clay. And you think, yeah, where's the soul in this movie? There's just the clay. There's just this kind of ponderous, dry, depressing, long pause, psychological narrative. And everybody turns miserable in the movie as a result. It's not just Odysseus, who I think his character is kind of ruined by the removal of the mythological elements, but Telemachus too becomes this like big sad boy hours angsty teenager. There's enormous F you dad energy throughout this movie. He's played by this sort of like wilting, willowy guy. He's surrounded by these very studly suitors, many of whom are like totally jacked. And Telemachus is like kind of skinny fat, and he's like moping around, and he's just, very like kind of weak-chinned sort of dude. But the whole story of Telemachus is supposed to be about his discovery of his manhood in the absence of his father, that he's able to take up the mantle of kind of leader of the house, for which, of course, he requires mentees. He requires this person, this man who is actually Athena in disguise. Again, can't do that, had to cut that character. And so instead, the only potential male mentor he has, once you've removed that Athena character from the story, once you've removed his literal mentor, the only possible adult male role model he has is Antinous, who's this kind of leader of the suitors. In the poem, Antinous is kind of villain number one. He's sort of the mob boss, the ringleader. He's the guy that has to die. And this movie does make him a little bit sinister and manipulative, but it also shades him in. It sort of gives him the Elphaba treatment from Wicked. Like, another movie that recently came out is that adaptation of the stage musical, which is an adaptation of a book about how the Wicked Witch of the West is secretly the good guy in The Wizard of Oz. And this is something, I am kind of a hypocrite about this because I loved the movie Wicked. I love the show Wicked. It intersects for me with peak theater kid energy. Like when I was at my most theater kid, that's when Wicked was huge on Broadway. And so I loved the show. I still love the show. I still think the music's pretty good. But fundamentally, the story itself represents a trend that I absolutely deplore, that also makes no sense, which is the misunderstood villain trope. You've gotten this now everywhere. You get it in Rings of Power. You get this thing where the orcs are sort of more complicated and misunderstood than we previously thought in Lord of the Rings. You get it in Wicked. There are a bunch of different ones where it's like this classic story that you've told. I think they're making one now about Grendel from Beowulf. And my feeling about this is, like, not only is it a very modern idea that, oh, all the villains are actually just misunderstood, it totally destroys itself when you actually watch these movies, because it's like, oh, Elphaba wasn't the villain. Like the Green Witch, the bad witch in The Wizard of Oz wasn't the villain. Some other person was the villain. So it's like you still have a villain. It's just that you've like indulged in this weird fantasy. You can kind of suggest that nobody's really a villain. Nobody really does bad things for bad reasons. And besides just not being true, it also destroys the story. Like some stories are about villains and heroes. And Beowulf is a great example, right? Grendel is a monster. And the story is about how there's a monster over there. So if you change the story into being about how somebody kind of turned into a monster, you're just telling a totally different story. Like some stories include as part of their givens, in the same way that you go to watch Harry Potter and it's a given that there are wands that do magic, and it's a given that there are house elves, and that's like the premise of the story. That's not the object of the story. The premise is that these things exist, and what we are interested in is how those elements interact with one another. Some stories have the premise that there are monsters out there. There are dragons. There are weird, deformed beasts that we have to go and fight and conquer. And that is not actually, the story doesn't exist to explain how or why that is. The story exists to take that as a given and use that to convey certain realities. And similarly with Beowulf, right, the monster is there to convey the fact that, in fact, that really there are bad, terrible adversities that we have to face and we have to summon courage to defeat them. If instead what we have to do is like psychologize them and find out how their parents mistreated them, you know, we've really just deferred the question. It's like, well, okay, so how then do we conquer the parents? Like, how do we deal with that bad thing? So this is generally a trend that I sort of find very annoying and also incoherent. And they sort of do it with Antinous. They're like, this guy, you know, he's got his reasons and he's actually kind of trying to reach out to Telemachus. And Penelope seems like maybe a little bit into him, unclear. There's some suggestion that she's like wavering about this, which again, not Penelope's story. We'll get to Penelope in a second. I have a whole bunch of complaints about Penelope, but like, that's not the character of Antinous. And it does totally transform this story into like, this sort of moody, rebellious teenager versus like, you're not my dad, like versus the prospective stepdad. And ultimately, you know, Antinous is in the wrong, but as we will discuss, like he sort of gets redeemed in this movie and he becomes the representative of the ideal version of the suitors. So one thing I've said before about this poem is that there is a way in which you could imagine the suitors having a point, right? The suitors are there. There's been a 10-year absence and ultimately a 20-year power vacuum on the island. They have to fill it. They want to do so in a way that kind of restores the integrity of the royal household, and that means marrying the woman whom everybody thinks of as the widow of Odysseus, right? So you can imagine a good version of the suitors. It's possible to conceive of virtuous suitors. But the story is that the suitors are a bad version of the suitors. And that is also integral to the story, is that they actually have taken advantage of the situation, and they're going about their task in an immoral, bad way. They're eating all the food, they're not helping, they are sleeping with all the serving girls, right? They're eating Penelope and Telemachus out of house and home, and they're disrespecting the son of the house, who probably should be, by rights, moving toward taking over the family estate. They've instead kind of oppressed both him and Penelope. And that is, in fact, the story that Homer told. It's not that it's not possible to conceive of the good suitors. It's just that then you're telling a totally different story. So this whole thing where like Antinous kind of has a point, I thought was like really misguided, but also they were left with no other choice after eliminating the gods, because otherwise, if you don't have Athena to kind of coach Telemachus up, you have to give him somebody else to play against as like the older mentor. And so that they did that with Antinous. But in that context, if Antinous is his only male role model, and if Odysseus is not, in fact, the heroic fighter trying to get home, but the like depressed weirdo that can't get over his PTSD, then Telemachus has good reason to be super resentful of his father, which is, in fact, what happens. Odysseus reveals himself, and they instantly get into like a big fight that never really quite resolves. There's sort of an open question as the movie draws to its conclusion, whether Telemachus and Odysseus are ever going to make peace with one another. We definitely don't get the most fun part of the last section of the poem, which is the buddy cop father-son duo fighting against the suitors. They team up. They have this whole plan. They're going to hide the weapons. They're going to surprise the suitors at their feast. Like, we don't get any of that. And instead we just get like tension and pain and anger between Odysseus and Telemachus, and they've maneuvered themselves into a position where that's the only thing we can possibly imagine, because their quote-unquote realism only allows them to look at the negative elements of the story. Is that there in the poem? 100%, absolutely. But let me read to you the passage where Telemachus finally realizes that this old man is Odysseus and that his father has come home. This is how it goes in the poem. This is my translation of the passage in the poem where this happens. Telemachus slumped in his father's arms and sobbed, face streaming with tears. Cries of their longing for one another burst out of them both. More keenly and thickly they cried aloud than a flock of birds, their voices like those of the taloned vultures whose infant chicks are snatched up by backwoods farmers before they're fully fledged. In just the same way, they grieved, and their tears were soaking their cheeks. They could have gone on and on like that, sobbing all day until sunset. So that's a beautiful passage. I mean, that is like Homer at his best. It sort of reminds me of the moment when Achilles and Priam at the end of the Iliad have to reconcile, that they too sob in one another's arms for everything they've lost, for everything that they hope will happen, for the like end, the catharsis of the war. This is another moment of like catharsis and words, thoughts that are too deep for words and can only be expressed in tears, right? They have to weep with one another because, yeah, I'm sure Telemachus is thinking like, where were you? What took you so long? How come you didn't come home, right? But there are answers to those questions, and ultimately Telemachus is delighted, glad that his father is home, because now order can be restored to the household, and they immediately team up and work together, and Odysseus takes charge and is the father figure, and Telemachus has desperately needed that, right? We know, of course, that Telemachus would need that, would need a good father. He doesn't have it in Antinous. He's become, in this version, deeply resentful of Odysseus, and this speaks to one of the biggest problems of our time, which is we cannot conceive of virtuous fatherly authority. We call that patriarchy, right? We have a bad word for it. And this movie falls right into that trap where all it can give us is resentment of a father that has lost his way, that has fallen short. And because they've already created in Ralph Fiennes' Odysseus, they've created a guy that has totally fallen short. This is the only avenue that's available to them, but it's actually much less rich and interesting than what happens in the poem, where yes, there's resentment, yes, there's longing, but then there's also joy and reconciliation, and there is this movement toward one another that is expressed in this beautiful image of the birds crying over their infant chicks, they're little bird babies, right? And you could have shot this perfectly. I mean, if you have two good enough actors, and Fiennes is a terrific actor. I thought the guy who played Telemachus was whatever, he was fine. But like, Fiennes is amazing. If they could have collapsed in one another's arms, you could even have had the birds like wheeling and crying overhead to sort of like mingle with the sound of their tears. Like, you don't have to, make it magical. You don't have to have sparkly fairies dancing or whatever. You could have just shot this reconciliation and it would have been so much more powerful. But by the time they get there, it's impossible for them to do that. All they can do is this very boring and kind of now played out modern idea of the F you dad energy. Like, well, I'm so mad that my dad fell short. It's like, yeah, okay. We've sort of seen that story before. What I haven't seen on camera is like a good father who has been kept away from his son, like coming at long last to sort of reestablish their connection, their relationship, which, by the way, happens all the time. Like, have you ever seen a video of a soldier coming home from war? Like, there's some of the most moving shots on like TikTok and Instagram, and even on Twitter sometimes you will see like these babies or these young children that have been left behind by people that had to go to war, and then they run to their father and they weep and the dog comes. Like, these are real scenes that happen in reality. That's what I'm trying to get across, right? Like, realism is not reality. Like, actual reality includes good fathers coming home from war and being given a hero's welcome and being loved by their children, right? That is all in this poem, and that's kind of the whole point of the poem. It's the story the poem exists to tell. And we can't tell that story because it's not, quote unquote, realistic. Never mind that it happens all the time. So I was very annoyed by the whole Telemachus thing. I thought that was like a total disaster. He also hates Penelope, which is not what happens in the poem. There's a very delicate relationship between Telemachus and Penelope, but it's not one of unmitigated antipathy like it is in this movie. He's very, very angry. He's kind of nasty to her, very teenage rebellious. He is teenage and rebellious in the poem, but he's teenage and rebellious in a way that is like necessary maturation for both of them. Like, he's taking up his position as an adult. He sometimes speaks to her too harshly, but she also kind of understands what he's going through. Here they are just at daggers drawn because Telemachus is convinced that Odysseus is dead. And so then another moment where the realism makes less sense than the actual poem, he then goes on this like journey, which we have in the poem. The opening of the poem is Telemachus going to find news of his father because he really wants to hear about what has happened to his dad. In this, he's already decided his father is dead. So it's totally unclear why he leaves. We have this weird situation where Laertes, the father, has been turned into like almost a dementia patient. Like, he is driven mad with grief. He dies early, which means that Odysseus never gets his reconciliation with his father, which is a major part of the end of the poem. And his death kind of is used as a catalyst for the climactic scene, which we talked about when we dealt with the poem itself. There is this moment where Odysseus famously, there's a bow that only Odysseus can draw, can only string the bow. Because he is the master of the house and he has this bow that is very difficult to string and to draw, and then he shoots an arrow through all of these axe heads. And again, this is visually very beautiful in the movie. And I get why they killed off Laertes, because that's what you were waiting for, right? You were weaving this burial shroud. Penelope's waiting for the death of her father-in-law. So now, like, this is a kind of plot device that Laertes dies and she can't make that excuse anymore. And also Antinous finds her out, figures out that she's been unweaving the shroud and says, gotta decide. So she says, all right, here it is. And not a moment too soon, because we've already had now the kind of reconciliation. There's this sort of like chase through the wilderness between the suitors and Odysseus. A lot of stuff that's not in the poem, but whatever. Like, okay, now Odysseus gets to the point where he is disguised as a beggar among the suitors, and he is there when Penelope launches her challenge, which is, can anybody string this bow? I will marry the man that can do the thing that my husband used to be able to do. And she says something like, would you be a lesser man? Like, no, we must all string the bow. All right. Now, at this point, this movie had so totally lost me that it probably couldn't have won me back. But if it had a chance to win me back, it was in this famous moment of stringing the bow. And again, like, total disappointment. Because, here's why. Odysseus has an element of his character that's really not emphasized in this movie, which is that he is a smart guy, right? He's the crafty one. And we've talked a lot about this. He's the guy that can deceive and dissemble and lie, and he has to figure out how to do that in a morally virtuous way, and is it possible to lie virtuously, and all that stuff is part of his character. He's also a studly hero. He also is stronger than everybody else. He's like a big kind of like towering guy that went off to war. And the whole idea of him is that in addition to being able to fight hand to hand with these towering giants, he's very crafty and smart. This movie doesn't really give him a lot of chances to show that he's crafty and smart. Instead, he has another ponderous, boring, brooding speech about how people tell stories, about the Trojan, but it was really just like he tells the story of the Trojan horse in this kind of weird, like disjointed way, because we're supposed to conclude that actually it was a very sordid affair, and now he's traumatized by all the blood and the gore. And so he tells this story, and he's like, people just tell the stories they want to tell. So we get this idea that Odysseus is like kind of disillusioned and canny about rhetoric, and that's sort of this movie's version of conveying that he has kind of a hyper-developed sense of rhetoric and narrative weaving and all that. But again, like, it can't give him any credit for that. Like, it can't make him happy about having won the Trojan War, and so it can only sort of vaguely allude to this. So there's no chance for us to see that Odysseus is the trickster, is the craftsman, is the smart guy. And because of that, they have to take that character element and put it into the episode with the bow, where he's trying to string the bow. And the problem with that is the episode where he strings the bow is supposed to be where we see that in addition to being really smart, he's also just a brawny hero. He's like literally stronger than all these guys, and so he can bend this physical object into his will. And like, that's kind of the whole point of the episode is, yes, Odysseus is smart, yes, he's crafty, yes, he's been on all these journeys, but also sometimes there comes a moment when you have to deliver a beatdown, and the stringing of the bow is the opening of that segment, that sequence in the movie. In the movie, though, he doesn't actually use brute force to bend the bow. He waves it over the fire, which would in fact loosen up the wood and make it more pliable. And so this is conveying to us that like Odysseus is usually outsmarting the suitors. I thought that was the totally wrong moment for him to do that. Like, yes, he should outsmart the suitors. Yes, he should be crafty. And we do get elements of that throughout the movie, but this is not the time for that. This is the time for us to see that our hero is also a hero. And then there ensues what, of course, predictably in the movie, is just a gore fest and is not in any way redemptive or acceptable and is way over the top. And Penelope, in the last moment, screams at him not to kill Antinous, who dies last, and who is, as we've said, sort of virtuous or partially virtuous. And so we're supposed to feel bad that Antinous has been killed, and we're supposed to feel like this is a moment of excess. But the problem, again, like the poem contains an extraordinarily sophisticated engagement with this question. How far is too far? How many people does Odysseus have to kill? Whom should he kill? Whom should he not? And it's Telemachus in the poem who has to stop him. Who he gets up to Phemius, the singer, and Phemius is begging for mercy. And Telemachus says, you know what, Phemius wasn't actually complicit in this, so you should spare his life. And that is when Odysseus pulls back from the brink and doesn't become the savage killer. And it's a very important character development, both for Telemachus and for Odysseus, and part of their reconciliation. In this, Telemachus is like sort of skulking around in the background while they have this fight. The fight is in no way as dramatic and fun as it is in the poem. You don't get like swords, tables used as shields. You get people hiding behind tables. And then you get Penelope screaming, don't do this. And then Odysseus does, in fact, slaughter Antinous, whom Penelope is trying to save. And so we don't get the sort of careful engagement with the ancient ethics of slaughter and warfare that the poem gives us. The movie thinks it's being so sophisticated and so morally elevated and complex. The poem is far more morally complex in that it actually distinguishes between people that Odysseus should and shouldn't kill. It gives Telemachus that role, and it enables us to see Odysseus pulling back from the brink of total, unmitigated warlust. Instead, what we get is Penelope trying to save somebody who probably shouldn't be saved, Odysseus not listening to her, and therefore not having any moment of actual introspection about war, but just this kind of nihilism of like, well, I feel bad about war, but also I'm just doing war all the time, and everything is bleak and sad. Again, I read this poem. I remember this poem. It has a happy ending. Penelope and Odysseus don't even kiss in this movie. How do you make an entire movie about the return of Odysseus from his journeys, and Penelope and Odysseus don't even kiss? Here's the scene where Penelope wonders whether Odysseus might have come home, because she has a dream that predicts that she might have come home. But she can't believe it, so she doesn't want to hope, she doesn't want to believe. She says, dreams are opaque in their meaning and hard to pin down in the form that they come to us, never fulfilled in full among men. They come to us through two portals, twin gates for elusive dreams. One pair of gates is made out of horn and the other of ivory. As for the ones that pass through the gates of sculpted ivory, they evade us. The claims they bring with them are never borne out. But as for the ones that pass through the doors made of sanded horn, they are born to fulfillment. Their truths come to pass before our eyes. But my own baffling dream didn't pass that way, I don't think. In other words, I don't think that this is a real dream. I don't think I can really believe that Odysseus is home. If it had, if that were true, what a welcome gift it would be to me and my boy. We would love, it would be so great if Odysseus came home. And then he finally persuades her who he is. She finally recognizes him. And she is delighted because, of course, in the ancient world, like a woman who had been waiting and like hoping against hope and holding out with this incredible act of fidelity would be so happy. She would not be like, oh, did you kill people in war? Like, I'm very conflicted about your role in this entire affair, my husband. Like, no, that's his job. He's sort of like dealt with that by the time he gets to her. And then they are together and it's happy. And that's how the story goes, right? Again, it's not that you can't change elements of the story. It's not that I'm bothered by like stripping out certain events or rearranging the order of things, or even like the early death of Laertes doesn't bother me. The absence of the gods doesn't bother me. It's that these are totally different characters, totally different people, and they don't really make any sense. Like the Odysseus who comes home is not really a fully fledged or realized individual, and the answers that he gives people about where he's been are not satisfying, and the people who ask those questions about where he's been, like, don't press him further for more satisfying answers. So really this movie is, besides being like depressing, is sort of incoherent. Like, what is anybody's motivation? The only person I understand in this movie, and my favorite character rendition, is Eurycleia. Eurycleia the nurse, who has been waiting for Odysseus, who recognizes him because she sees his scar, and she was his wet nurse, so she nursed him as a little baby, and now she's like this old woman in the house, played in this movie just like beyond well by Angela Molina. Like, this is a tough as nails old broad, and she just plays Eurycleia as like one of these Greek women. We've all, if you've been to Greece and you've talked to like a shopkeeper, you've probably met this woman. She's just like, you know, when he says don't tell, you know, he has to silence her from telling everybody that he's home, and she goes, yes, they are not strong like us, like they cannot know. And when Penelope is sort of like brooding and depressed about the slaughter of the suitors and how like, oh, we tried to keep the peace this whole time, Eurycleia has this great line, that was no peace, there was no other way. And I just thought, like, I'm 100% with Eurycleia. I think we're supposed to be conflicted about whether or not like Eurycleia is right or Penelope is right, and whether this is good and whether Odysseus is good. It's like, I'm sorry, but like, Eurycleia is right. And I was glad that they gave her that to say. I was glad that she was in there, that they offered that perspective. But I just thought, because they had removed all of the actual conflict from the poem, because they weren't able to tell the story that Odysseus is actually facing, which is the attempt, the fight to get back home, that he wants to get home, they had to introduce all of this other conflict from their modern sensibilities, which are very played out and kind of boring at this point. Like, we've all seen the anti-hero. We've all seen the guy that's demythologized. Oh yes, like the hero wasn't really as great a dude as we thought he was. Like, this is all sort of done and done to death in the modern world. It would have been much more interesting and exciting to actually do the poem as Homer composed it and just say like, yeah, this is a guy who came home and reclaimed his hearth and his family, was reconciled with his son. It was a very joyous occasion. There were many trials and difficulties and many moral conflicts, but they were surmounted, and wasn't it awesome? Like, that's what happens at the end of that poem, and that is a much more interesting and morally complex and sophisticated story than this story, which is actually really one-noted and really drab and really boring. I'm so sorry. I wish that I could have given this movie a good review because I was really excited for it. On the other hand, it was the occasion for us to spend many weeks talking about Homer, which is never wasted time. And in fact, even going to this movie, which I recommend you do, and write into me about what you think, and it's interesting to think about this movie and to see how they adapt it, And even going to this movie was illuminating because it made me appreciate Homer more. It made me see some of the nuances that are there in the poem that were not captured by this more narrow modern sensibility. So no time spent with Homer is ever wasted. This time has definitely not been wasted. It was really fun to talk with you about this poem. We're going to do the Aeneid in the new year, when the new year comes in. In the meantime, if you want to read more about some of the stuff I was saying, you should go to thenewjerusalem.substack.com, because my dad just today wrote a letter to me on this website, this Substack. We write letters back and forth to each other. And my dad wrote one about realism versus reality. And he says a lot of the similar stuff to what I'm saying here, and he broadens it out to like some other movies, like the movie about Flight United 93. He talks about how that movie also kind of indulges in this pseudo-realism that isn't actually realistic, and how actual reality includes heroism, includes delight, includes triumph and redemption, as well as depression and angst and self-doubt and all of that stuff. So go to the New Jerusalem. If you're not there already, you should be subscribed at newjerusalem.substack.com. I'll put the link in the description of this episode, because it's, I think, just a conversation that you won't find anywhere else on the internet. And you can support us, which we would really appreciate, by becoming a paid subscriber there as well. I'm going to leave it at that. Please do write into me at rejoiceevermore.substack.com if you want to tell me what you thought of the movie. I would be very interested to know. This is a good time to become a member at these Substacks, because it's the Advent season and Christmas is coming up, and we're giving some discounts and stuff like that. So you should go check that out. And please do let me know what you think. Do also write in with questions. I haven't been doing the mailbag recently because I've had a few special episodes to do like this one, but I am going to answer your questions down the line. So keep writing into me with mailbag questions. And finally, don't forget to check out my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith. It is now available in audiobook format as well. So if you like listening to things, as I assume you do, since you're here in this podcast, you can hear me reading the book about the history of science and how it has related to the history of faith and where we might be going in the future with that. If you could rate it 5 stars on Amazon, I would be enormously grateful. That would be an awesome Christmas gift to me, as well as sharing this show. Tweet it out, put it on Instagram, share it with your group chat, rate it 5 stars on Apple Podcast. All of that really helps me. Thank you for journeying with me through the real Iliad and the real Odyssey, and also through this movie, The Return, which, even though I didn't like it at all, was actually like really interesting and fun to talk about with you guys. So we will do more of it, more talking together next time. I will see you again for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.